I'm Mark Gagan and welcome to a special documentary-style episode of The Voice of Insurance, produced in association with Beazley. Today we're going to go much deeper into the world of cyber attacks than we've ever done before. We'll be looking at the insurance claims that they produce, as well as all the longer-term consequences for their victims. Often as journalists covering cyber insurance, we focus on the big hacks, the headline numbers, and gloss over the detail of the personal stories and the real hard yards that have to be run to recover from an attack and the potential long-term consequences for a business, its directors, its customers, and all other stakeholders. As the immediate damage and business interruption triggers potential regulatory, statutory, and other serious third-party consequences, these hard yards often have to be run down multiple different paths simultaneously. But are company directors taking the threat seriously enough? Well, yes and no. Beazley's latest Tech Transformation and Cyber Risk and Resilience survey is really interesting because it shows a significant shift in cyber risk perception and perceived resilience. For the first time since 2021, concern over cyber risk has risen, with 29% of global executives saying this risk is their greatest threat, up from 26% in 2024. By the way, there'll be a link to this excellent report in the podcast notes. I'd definitely recommend downloading this for further reading. But even as executives' awareness of cyber risk grows, it's perhaps strange that they seem to feel more prepared. These same executives' perception of their resilience to such threats has risen from 75% in 2024 to 83% this year. It's highly likely that many are underestimating the true threat. Recent high-profile ransomware attacks on major UK retailers have made it clear that failure to recognise this reality leaves businesses increasingly vulnerable to today's fast-evolving digital threats. The in-depth interviews that follow will deepen your understanding of the more complex and long-tail nature of this peril. I'd like to put you right in the room, in the shoes of the directors of a company as an attack unfolds. We're going to go behind the scenes to uncover what it's really like when a business becomes the target of a digital assault, from the immediate shock to the long-term repercussions that are often ignored by boards. We're also going to go into detail on how the nature of the cyber threat and the tactics of cyber criminals are evolving. To help me in this task, my guests are Magnus Jelen, Director of Incident Response, EMEA for Coveware, a firm that helps victims of cyber extortion recover their data, and three senior executives at Beazley, Raf Sanchez, Beazley's Head of Cyber Services, Cyber Risks, Melissa Collins, Head of Third-Party Cyber and Tech Claims, and Wayne Imrie, Head of London Market Wholesale Executive Risks. Magnus and Raf are right on the front line, dealing with the immediate consequences of a hack. Magnus even deals with the hackers themselves. Melissa deals with the external insurance claims that result. And Wayne is a D&O, Directors and Officers Specialist, who has a deep understanding of how the D&O and cyber insurance products interact. So let's begin at the very beginning. The moment a cyber attack is discovered, when the balloon goes up and a dread, sinking feeling might set in. What are the immediate priorities for those on the front lines, such as the incident response teams? I asked Magnus Jelen to start things off. You're the sort of fire brigade. What is your very first priorities? What do you want to, when you first called in, to establish?
One of the absolute first things that we want to do is to understand the situation of the impacted company. What are they actually dealing with? Is it a false alert? Do we think it's an incident and it's not? Or is it, unfortunately, widespread encryption and exfiltrated data? We need to kind of understand what's their current situation so we can assess the situation. And then we need to try to figure out who's the threat actor we're talking about. And then we can start providing intelligence and advice on their current situation and different options that we see to move forward.
So establishing the exact nature of the situation and who the threat actor is paramount. Indeed, the discovery itself can happen in various ways. It's not always a direct ransom demand. How quickly does it tend to happen? Is this something that varies a lot?
It does vary a lot. If you talk about dwell time, so the time from when they first get access until they roll out the attack, the dwell time is generally going down. We're seeing more attacks with a shorter dwell time. If you go back a few years, you would see attacks with much longer dwell time where it appeared that the threat actor was preparing more and staging more within the environment. We're seeing more attacks now that are quicker, that are faster compared to what we used to see.
Shorter dwell times are interesting. I asked Magnus what this tells us about the evolving nature of threat actors and our collective defences.
It's telling us a few different things. First of all, they know that companies are getting better at picking up on this. If you go back in time, more threat actors knew that maybe they had more time. As long as they remained quiet and try to go under the radar, they could have more time to move around inside the environment and find what they wanted and do what they wanted to do, prepare what they wanted to prepare. Generally, they're understanding that companies are getting better at picking up on this. So security posture is getting better. We're also seeing, and this is kind of a sidetrack, but because of some of the larger groups that have been taken down by law enforcement, we're seeing more what we call lone wolves. So maybe individual threat actors operating. Some of them don't have the same technical capabilities as some of the bigger brands had. So they might not have the capability to have a long dwell time or to roll out a sophisticated an attack as we saw before.
So good news. As individual lone wolves might lack the sophistication for longer, more complex attacks, this overall trend is a positive one. Once the initial chaos is addressed, the next critical phase involves understanding the threat actor and what they want. What's the typical demand? Is it so many bitcoins in this account and here's the link?
So the typical demand, it really varies. The threat actors will usually try to calculate how far they can push it with the specific victim. They will try to find numbers and try to calculate how much money would this company be able to pay. But average numbers are difficult in this field because all incidents are different, and it really depends on the size of the company and what specific threat actor group you're up against.
So ransom demands are highly variable and tailored to what the threat actor believes a specific victim can pay. And as for the currency, there's no surprise there.
Yes, cryptocurrency is the way this is done. Of course, if you were to do a wire transfer or to pay, in physical cash, that would, of course, increase the risk towards the TA. So cryptocurrency is an important factor in this criminal economy.
By the way, TA is an abbreviation of threat actor. It's also important to dispel a common misconception. Paying the ransom does not necessarily guarantee a quick, pain-free resolution to the problem.
No, it's not. Long story short. And I think that is where you can really see the value of companies who have prepared and companies who have, for instance, have good cyber insurance and have a standing relationship with their insurance carrier. So they, through that carrier, know what vendors to bring in. They have access to those vendors. Because unfortunately, we do hear about companies who try to navigate an incident like this on their own and who fall into the trap of thinking, oh, this is straightforward because the threat actor is telling me it's straightforward. They're saying it's easy as 1, 2, 3, you pay me, and then it's all over. Again, I said we do a high number of incidents. I can't recall any incident where acquiring a threat actor's decryption tool was just a pain-free and easy process.
So here's the first insight. One of the biggest mistakes companies can make during an attack is to try to navigate it alone.
I wouldn't say it's common, but in cases where we hear about after the fact that companies try to navigate the incident all alone, it's usually not a good thing. The vast, vast majority of companies are not experienced enough or equipped enough to navigate an incident like this because it takes experience and it takes having worked through incidents like this before to be able to navigate them. So usually one of the biggest mistakes would be if a company said, no, we'll deal with this on our own. We don't need forensics. We don't need to bring in insurance. We don't need legal counsel. We don't need a company like Codeware. We can do this on our own. It's not common for that to end in a good place.
So there's no substitute for proper preparation, including having the right network of experts and specialist cyber insurance in place. This also means practical training, not just theoretical planning. It's perhaps unsurprising that companies that physically practice recovery scenarios typically get back on their feet faster when it really matters.
Well, obviously, you have to prepare and you have to work on making sure that your security posture is as good as possible. But today, you also have to prepare to navigate an incident. You cannot solely rely and say, we'll do everything we can to prevent an incident and then we'll never have an incident, because it's likely that you will. And you have to be able to navigate a full-blown incident as well. We do see companies who prepare that. We do see companies who practice that, who practice all the way through their tabletops, even practice a golden ticket reset of all accounts, for instance, or try to recover from backups. We see companies who've done that in a training situation usually are able to recover faster during a live incident versus companies who simulated it but never really did it. If you've never rolled out your backups during a training situation, if the first time you're going to roll them out is during a live incident, it's most likely going to be very uncomfortable.
So take that business continuity plan off the shelf where it's been gathering dust and try and execute it. you'll probably rewrite it if you do. It's time to bring in Raf Sanchez. His team sees a large number of incidents a year, and he underscores the complex personal nature of a cyber crisis for the victims.
These do happen very, very frequently. My team handles about 5,000 a year. But for the individuals involved, it's often their first encounter with a serious cyber crisis. And it could be a malicious incident. It could be an accidental problem or data leakage. Very often it's an issue with a third party. And so whilst there are patterns, and whilst, for example, we often talk to our clients about having playbooks and runbooks and procedures and policies to deal with these things, every scenario is different, and it depends on the data and the individuals involved and the type of organization and their tolerance for downtime. So I think the key thing is to not have an overly restrictive approach, particularly as an outsider. We are representing a third party often that these organizations have put some trust in. So we feel very keenly the sense of having to build a relationship with our clients, unfortunately, in most cases at a time of crisis. So we want to be adaptable, we listen to the problems they have, and we're trying to present them with solutions. But yes, for many stakeholders, it's probably the first time they've had this happen to their organization. It can feel quite personal. Certainly, the different stakeholders involved will have different motivations and objectives in terms of recovery. So all of that makes this whole scenario complex. And whenever you have a complex risk, that's really where you're looking for experts such as Beazley or other organizations who've experienced this multiple times to help you.
Raf's is just the sort of calming voice I'd like to hear if my back was against the wall. A key insight from Raf is that cyber incidents are way beyond tech going wrong, and the solution to the problem has to be much more holistic than you would imagine.
If you're looking at a type of expertise, I think the one thing we try to do is show stakeholders how these incidents are not technology problems. They are enterprise-wide problems, malicious or accidental, and they require a coordinated approach and response. So this is not just about the technology team, the IT team, closing down the firewall or changing how their defensive security tooling works. This is about, for example, if you have a vendor issue, absolutely, there's a very strong legal component. What do your contracts say with your third parties? If it's an accidental issue, a data leak because of a well-intentioned but ultimately a person not following a policy, there we're looking at culture. So the first thing to mention is it requires a coordinated response. It's not just a technology problem. The second element is we definitely try to highlight that these organizations usually have limited resources. And we, as an insurance carrier, again, thinking about the kind of losses that we see, we would like those stakeholders internally and their teams to be working on BAU. They should be continuing to run their operations, whether it's a school, hospital, logistics company, IT software company, whatever it is, the resources they have, what we're really trying to do is keep them working on business as usual, allow the crisis to be heavy lifted by these external experts who absolutely are well practiced in mitigating these incidents.
In case you didn't know, BAU stands for business as usual. Here, enabling normal business to resume as soon as possible means bringing together various experts, legal, forensics, communications, to ensure a unified approach, allowing the affected company teams to focus on the day-to-day. The duration of involvement varies, from weeks to months for incident response and potentially years if third parties are affected and actions ensue. It largely depends on the organisation's objectives, resources and the nature of the data in question.
So Beazley as an insurance carrier could typically be involved for about 9 months on a ransomware incident, depending on whether there's litigation. But on the incident response phase, I would say you're looking at a very wide range from a couple of weeks to a couple of months. And that really does depend on what are the objectives of the organization, what resources do they have backups, do they have a situation where there has been data exfiltration, are they established in many different countries, are they subject to different laws and regulation and regulators, how many clients do they have, how many employees do they have. So it's a super complex Venn diagram and we don't assume anything. So whilst we can look to threat actors' ways of approaching attacks, so we know what certain threat actors are going to do. What we don't know is necessarily the motivations and the objectives of the business. We have organizations who tell us they can sustain no longer than a 48-hour outage before they effectively don't have a business anymore. We deal with healthcare and educational establishments where protecting vulnerable people's and children's data is the absolute crucial priority, and they can sustain outages and move to alternative procedures, backups, and manual workarounds if they can preserve the confidentiality and integrity of data. So yes, in terms of simply time, there's a huge range, and it's impacted a lot by what the ultimate objectives of the stakeholders within the business or organization we're trying to protect are.
One disturbing trend Raf highlighted is the increasingly malicious tactics employed by threat actors, moving beyond just data and systems.
We've definitely seen a real acceleration in the use of personal information against our clients. And so in terms of what we used to consider out of the ordinary, we now find individual stakeholders within our clients having quite personal information revealed about themselves by a threat actor. And that really, I think, is the next stage of leverage these groups are having. So we always worried about the productivity impact of an encryption event. We then worried about corporate data being compromised and being shared externally. And I think now what I worry about more is the humans being leveraged and their personal information being accessed or shared. So we have seen personal threats against individuals. We've seen phone calls on home telephone lines. We've seen funeral bouquets and arrangements being sent. And I think that's what's a concerning development that used to be completely out of the ordinary and is now fairly commonplace.
Picking up on Magnus's point earlier, I asked Raf if perhaps this escalation to personal extortion, including using deeply private information, reflected hackers' increased frustration as organisations improved their defences.
Yes, because as organisations have got better at recovering from backups, as there is a wider marketplace and access to experts such as Beazley's cyber services team, the threat actors are being paid less frequently. And so with that comes an increased emphasis on getting a payout when they do think there's an appetite within an organisation to pay. So they're leveraging every single tool in their toolbox to extract that payment. And that's, again, something that we didn't used to see so frequently and is now an unfortunately more frequent occurrence.
This is a chilling and unpleasant development that every company director should be aware of. Now, let's turn our attention to the longer tail of cyber attacks, the often overlooked liability risks that can emerge long after the immediate incident is resolved. This is where Melissa Collins, Beazley's head of third-party cyber and tech claims, provides crucial insights. I started off by asking her what the most common third-party losses stemming from cyber breaches are.
So first off, as you well know, cyber breaches tend to result in the exposure of personal data, and therein lies the third-party liability problem. So depending on the type of breach and the company that's impacted, the data exposed could include social security numbers or credit card information or more sensitive types of data like medical records or even genetic information. So the most common types of third-party liability lawsuits we see are data breach class actions. And these typically happen right after a breach. The plaintiff's bar gets out there right after a breach and they advertise and they try and seek and solicit clients to come and join their data breach class action. And these are increasing in frequency. We often see multiple class actions filed after a single breach, and they're all alleging that the company failed to implement and maintain certain reasonable security procedures and that people obviously were damaged by the loss of their data. So the claims that are asserted tend to be breach of contract, negligence, violations of privacy rights, and violations of certain state and federal statutes in the US or of the GDPR in the UK. What we see also, in addition to those third-party lawsuits, are regulatory investigations. Here in the States, the FTC gets involved, the SEC gets involved, and state attorneys general will all initiate proceedings investigating the company, particularly in sectors like healthcare and finance, where, again, more sensitive data may be at issue. And then those regulations can lead to penalties and parallel civil litigation.
So statutory requirements and penalties are proliferating. And data breach class actions are also on the rise. Here's more from Melissa on quantum.
In our view, the magnitude of a third-party loss is all about the data. The more data you have, the more people that are impacted, the bigger the loss from a third-party perspective. So essentially, when you look at risk perspective, data costs money, and companies need to really think strategically about protecting their data, minimizing their data, or at least being thoughtful about what kind of data they're collecting and whether they need all of it and they need to keep all of it. And then companies need to really have a plan all the way from the breach to the ultimate third-party lawsuits and regulatory investigations that will ensue.
What about the rise of systemic incidents, such as last summer's much publicised CrowdStrike incident? How much of a concern are they?
It's making our job more interesting, that's for sure. I mean, what we're seeing more of in the past couple of years are systemic vendor incidents. That's basically what you're talking about here. And those are cyber attacks where a hacker is exploiting a vulnerability, not in a particular company, but really in a widely used software or platform. And unlike an isolated breach, when that happens, those incidents have cascading impacts across multiple organizations simultaneously, and it creates a huge systemic risk. So we've seen that in the past couple of years in situations like MoveIt and Snowflake and CDK and CrowdStrike. It seems like every quarter there's another systemic vendor incident. And by way of example, just so people can understand like the magnitude of these types of breaches, the MoveIt breach affected, I think it was about 2,700 different organizations. That's a lot of different companies. And those organizations spanned financial institutions and law firms and government agencies. And I think it's estimated that about 93 million individuals were impacted across that breach. As we spoke about earlier, the more data that's out there and lost, the more individuals that are impacted, the more costly the breach is going to be.
Melissa mentioned the MoveIt breach, which led to around 200 class action lawsuits. These systemic events are expected to accelerate as hackers target hubs for maximum damage. Companies clearly need to proactively engage with vendors to understand contractual rights and liability caps. I asked Melissa if there were likely to be more subrogation claims against vendors who are breached in this way.
Subrogation actions are definitely on the rise, particularly as we see these downstream systemic events like MoveIt and like CrowdStrike. So there's an increased tendency for carriers to now seek to recover from vendors who they believe are legally responsible for that ultimate breach. But it's a bit complicated because those vendors often have these robust limitation of liability clauses capping their damages. So as a carrier or as a company looks into the risks and potential rewards of subrogation, they really want to investigate the contracts that they had with the vendors to make sure that there's enough at the end of the road and enough of a pot of gold to make that recovery action worthwhile.
So, as ever, the small print in contract wordings is key. As we move from first-party to third-party claims, the tail has to get longer. But how long is long in the cyber third-party claims world? Back to Melissa.
A tail in third-party liability always depends on the specific jurisdiction and the statute of limitations for the specific claims that are asserted. So it's based on how long does someone have to bring a lawsuit. That's the starting point. Technically, the claims that are typically brought in the data breach context would include a negligence claim or a breach of contract claim. And the negligence statute of limitations could be 2 to 3 years in most areas in the US. The breach of contract statute of limitations could be 4 to 6 years. So people have a number of years before they even need to start a lawsuit. And then they have 2 to 3 years for that lawsuit to work its way through the process. So technically speaking, the tail could run, let's say 5 to 8 years or 5 to 9 years on a data breach class action. Practically speaking, though, we don't see that in this context. Practically speaking, the tail here starts immediately after the breach, which is important for companies to understand because they're dealing with the class actions almost immediately when the breach happens. And the reason for that is that the plaintiff's bar wants to get out there as soon as there's a breach. And they get out there and they advertise and they seek a whole bunch of plaintiffs to join their class actions. And we actually are aware that now a number of them are starting to use artificial intelligence to help them with the advertisements and to target different areas and to get more plaintiffs onboarded faster, which certainly raises concerns about there being more class actions and it being easier for them to solicit clients. Once they get their clients onboarded, the lawsuit here is typically filed within a month to 3 months of the incident. So again, a shorter tail than we might see in other types of litigation. And because these matters typically don't go to trial, I really don't know of any that have been tried, you're usually seeing a settlement within 2 years, maybe 3 years of the litigation commencing. So again, in the third-party liability world, the tail is shorter here.
So a quicker plaintiff bar means a quicker resolution. There's also a preference for soliciting statutory damage components, which can be compensated in bulk rather than proving actual individual harm, something that might be hard to ascertain beyond doubt.
One of the big questions in a data breach class action is, was there actual damage? Did someone's information end up on the dark web, and was it used? And can the person demonstrate that there was damage? In a smaller percentage of the cases, the answer is yes. Courts grapple with that issue all the time. Do plaintiffs have a sustainable claim? Can they assert a claim if they can't show that their data was actually used inappropriately? Is it enough for them to just show that the data was lost and could be used down the line, but we don't know? So there's a percentage of cases where people can and do allege, my data was taken, my data was lost, I had a compromise and fraud on my credit card because my credit card number and social security number were out there. But what plaintiffs' counsel love are cases where there's a law, particularly in the US, that says you don't have to prove damage. You just have to prove that this happened. And if you prove that it happened, it's $1,000 a person or $5,000 a person. And so there's a statute in Illinois called JIPA. It's the Genetic Information Privacy Act. And Illinois has deemed genetic information particularly sensitive, which makes sense. And if you violate that statute, if you lose genetic information or if you collect it without consent, it's $1,000 per violation. So those cases are great for plaintiffs' counsel. So they're constantly looking for statutes and rules and regulations where they don't need to have an argument about damage. All they have to do is say, you're a company, you did this wrong, and now you get this penalty. So we see more of those, and we constantly see the plaintiffs' bar trying to find new ways of regenerating old laws and old regulations that are out there that have some kind of statutory damage component because it makes their cases easier.
This all makes absolute sense. Melissa shared the compelling case of DNA genetic testing company 23andMe as a prime example of the multifaceted challenges faced during a major breach.
One case that's really been interesting that involves a large-scale breach and sensitive data and class actions and regulatory investigations, it runs the gamut and it's garnered significant media attention, is the 23andMe breach, which has been in the news since, I think, October of 2023. They collect DNA from different people, and it's a really interesting test case, and I think there's a lot of learnings from that case for companies and people just generally. What's interesting about that one is they had a breach that started in April of 2023, and they didn't know about it. The breach went on for about 6 months, and it wasn't discovered until October of 2023. So during that time, the threat actor was in their systems collecting all sorts of different genetic information. And it turns out that they were able to collect profile and ethnicity information for about 7 million different users, which I think was about half of the company's world of users. The company in October of 2023 realizes that there's a breach and they publicly disclose it. And within that same month, there's 21 class actions that are started in federal courts. And within a few months, there's then 40 class actions that are started nationwide in the US. And of course, because there's genetic information involved, there's legal scrutiny at issue. The Connecticut Attorney General in the US investigates. There was a joint Canadian and UK investigation to determine whether or not the company had appropriate data protections and safeguards for that genetic information. And the class action went on. They just recently settled for $30 million. The company is now in bankruptcy, and there's a lot of concern about what's going to happen to the data as the company's in bankruptcy. I think there were actually articles just this morning about the data being sold or provided to some kind of a nonprofit, but there's still concerns about what will happen to it. And so to me, there's a lot of takeaways for companies for a case like 23andMe. And what is evident and what we talk to companies about all the time is that when they have a breach, when any company has a breach, They're dealing with 5 separate issues all at the same time. They're dealing with the incident response. In October of 2023, 23andMe was dealing with what do we do about this? How do we investigate it? What happened? How much data was lost? They're dealing potentially with a ransomware negotiation and understanding, should we pay the ransom? Should we not? What data did they access? Are we going to get it back? They're dealing with data recovery issues, trying to figure out how much data they lost, if it can be restored. They're dealing with business interruption problems because sometimes the parts of the company or the whole company are slowed down or shut down. And then they're dealing with third-party liability, class actions, and regulatory investigations that start almost instantaneously. So for companies that are having a breach situation, they've got these 5 different work streams all happening at the same time. And they really need to be ready with the right people and experts in place to help them through this.
Wow, 5 different concurrent streams that a prudent insured should be planning for. It's time to bring in our 4th expert and focus on the directors and officers' D&O liability aspect, a longer-term consequence that often gets overlooked. Wayne Imrie is a D&O expert. We don't really tend to think of the long tail consequences of cyber. What are they and how long is the tail?
The tail can be very long. If we think about the consequences of a major cyber incident and that morphing into a D&O securities class action, then we could be talking 900 days plus before anything really gets resolved and before we even get to the potential of a settlement or a verdict in any type of underlying action. We've seen them starting to grow in number and frequency and also grow in severity as we see more and more cyber incidents. And depending on how the company has reacted or responded to such a cyber event depends on the length of litigation and the type and the level of litigation.
Wayne stressed that directors and officers can be held accountable not just for their actions, but critically for their inaction, their omissions, or lack of preparedness.
Thinking about the preemptive work, if they haven't had cyber security as a board topic of discussion, if it's not deemed to be reporting into the right levels of executive management within a company, the incorrect due diligence or lack of due diligence is taking place, then that's obviously going to create some ongoing issues for them, especially from shareholder litigation or regulatory oversight and investigations. And then obviously when we talk about what they can do, responding to an incident is really critical. And we've seen that through the claims that have developed in the past. The way you respond, your transparency in your disclosures to both the street and the financial markets, but also your customers or your employees or others that could be impacted, really tell a tale. And if you get that incorrect at all, it's likely to be very costly at the end of the litigation or the investigation.
That's a lot of moving parts to worry about. Wayne said that a common grievance leading to D&O claims is a lack of transparency.
It's typically if you haven't told enough, you haven't delivered the impact, the complete potential impact, both operationally, financially, reputationally. And that's the real driver of severity that we have seen in the settlement so far has been around that lack of transparency and giving those impacted and those interested parties, such as shareholders and regulators, the true story of the potential size and severity of such an incident.
Regulatory bodies, like the SEC in the US, impose stringent disclosure requirements, often demanding information within 4 days of deeming an incident material. This adds pressure to boards already grappling with the immediate crisis.
You're in the mix of it. You're in that disaster response piece. And this really comes down to some of that preemptive work, because if you've done scenario testing, if you have correct disaster scenario planning in place and you have the ability to respond quickly by triggering plans that you already had sitting on the shelf ready to activate, then you will be in a better position to, one, quantify the impact and then be able to make that disclosure in a correct form to both the street and to your interested stakeholders.
Of course, the most common D&O claim arising from cyber incidents remains the securities class action.
Security class actions are still the major driver, especially for anyone who's writing publicly traded D&O. They tend to be the driver of all severity. And we've seen a lot more event-driven issues coming now rather than just disclosure around financials or guidance on how a company is performing. And we've seen cyber leading that charge around any type of breach event or failure to secure customers or consumers' private data, and having that easily accessible has driven some very large claims. Again, It's all around disclosures, really. The ability to be transparent and accurate and get the full impact out there so everyone can understand the true potential downside.
No wonder insiders sometimes only half-jokingly refer to D&O as the ultimate all-risks coverage. A key piece of advice for boards, according to Wayne, is to elevate cybersecurity to the highest level of discussion within the organisation.
It starts really around how do you control or manage and monitor your cybersecurity, and to what level does that feature and report into it within the business. We've seen over time, as we've spoken to our clients and we've worked with our clients, seen cybersecurity move up the levels within the organisation. It's no longer just an IT function. We've seen it move from the IT function into the operations function, reporting into the COO, and then the implementation of CISOs, the Chief Information Security Officer, becoming a full-time executive role. We're then seeing that morph into directly reporting into the CEO in some cases. And then we're seeing that become a monthly topic of discussion within the board level. And then what we're seeing at the board level is companies are making sure that they adequately build their boards with the right level of expertise. And that's having someone on the board that either has that background in cybersecurity or has knowledge of that as a specialism. And also maybe even someone with board experience who's been through an incident. That's quite key experience to have on a board to really test and probe what they're doing and how they're doing it and whether they're doing it to the best of their abilities.
While D&O and cyber policies are distinct, they often dovetail, with D&O picking up the third-party elements that arise from mishandled events. The question in my mind was whether D&O underwriters might tire of cyber events triggering claims and look to exclude cyber as a peril. Wayne was reassuring in this regard.
My view is that I think the D&O market is there to perform their function of protecting the board and protecting the individuals that are making decisions and to run companies. Part of running that company and making those decisions is the cybersecurity piece. I don't see necessarily the D&O market coming to a landing where they exclude cyber as a potential trigger to a typical D&O claim that could be a securities class action. I don't think the market is necessarily looking at that. I think the thing with D&O is it's all risks, really. Everything that goes on for an organisation, anything that impacts them, both financially or operationally, can morph into a D&O claim if it's mishandled, not disclosed correctly, or if there's an allegation of lack of management mitigation, due diligence, duty of oversight. Any of those will bubble up into a D&O claim. And I don't necessarily see the D&O market excluding cyber as an event that would drive or trigger a claim. But yeah, whilst there is crossover, cyber's definitely there to pick up the first party loss, and D&O is really there to pick up the third party element that comes on the back end of a potential mishandled event or a large event that could have been mitigated against. And that's where shareholders or regulatory bodies may become disgruntled and the board will become under extra scrutiny.
So, unhappy shareholders hold everyone on the board accountable, not just the CISO. Thanks to Wayne, Melissa, Raf and Magnus for their expert contributions from each of their specialist fields. So what have we learned? First, as cybersecurity, improved defensive postures and law enforcement get results, so cyber attacks are getting faster and much more aggressive and unpleasant in nature. And second, the plaintiff machine, set up to bring remedy to affected parties, is now extremely well oiled and efficient. The first party disruption of an attack and ransom is just the beginning. There is now near certainty that a breach will have indirect consequences for a company in terms of third-party claims. An incident will have, at the very least, 2 parallel tracks, often many more if regulators are in play and if public shareholders are affected. Thirdly, the consequences can be much longer tail than the initial cyber event. Third-party claims and regulatory investigations are common. An incident can ultimately stretch all the way to the personal responsibilities of board members to their shareholders. Cyber attacks are complex, rapidly evolving, and deeply human challenges. They demand immediate, coordinated expert response and rigorous long-term preparedness to manage not just the technical fallout, but also the significant financial, legal, and reputational losses that can come along with them. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast and you haven't found it too scary. The fact is that in the information age, a cyber attack and its multiple long-term consequences can be fatal for companies. Firms can never be too well prepared or drilled. They need to pre-plan and physically rehearse their responses. They also need to know that they cannot do this alone, and pre-hire the expert teams that are going to assist them in their hour of need and let them get back to business as usual as soon as possible, even while a loss and its long-term consequences rumble on. The responsibility ultimately rests with boards, but it's also clear that the best insurance can do an awful lot to help. Before I go, just a quick reminder to download Beazley's latest Tech Transformation and Cyber Risk and Resilience Survey. There's a link to this in the podcast notes. Thanks so much for listening. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, don't forget to subscribe or leave a like or a review or recommendation on whatever podcast platform you used to access this program. These really help get the word out. Before we go, just a quick reminder that advertising slots are available here and in other places in the Voice of Insurance podcasts. Podcasting is the fastest growing medium and attracts a high quality audience of key decision makers. It's also an intimate medium where you, the listener, are right in the room with me and the interview subjects. Needless to say, that means it's a great way of getting your message out directly to an audience because you know you've got their full attention. It's also very cost effective. So get in touch with Mark at thevoiceofinsurance.com to find out how you could be speaking directly to the industry. Voice of Insurance is produced by me, Mark Gagan. Music was written by Anna Gagan and produced by Carlos Gagan. Check out more podcasts and written comment pieces at www.thevoiceofinsurance.com.